Hello everyone, and welcome to another video as part of the series Python for Engineers. Today I'm going to be introducing the tuple object. But before I start, let me just say that if you're not familiar with Python variables and operators, please check out my video on YouTube and the accompanying Jupyter notebook on GitHub. I also have a video that is related to Python lists, and a lot of the concepts that I introduced there are also very related to the ones that we will be talking about today. So please check that video out, the Intro to Python Lists video, and also the accompanying Jupyter notebook. Okay, so in today's video, we're going to be talking about 5 main things. First thing we're going to talk about is what a tuple is in Python, and then we're going to talk about how do we create a tuple, and then how do we access whatever's inside the tuple. And then we're going to talk about the ability to modify the tuple, and then we'll end on some useful tuple operations. Okay, so let's start out with what a tuple is. So in Python, a tuple is an object that is immutable, and it's a sequence or an ordered collection of elements or items. And so the order in tuples, much like in lists, is very important. And tuples are typically denoted by the use of parentheses in between them. So let's go ahead and start out by making one tuple. So this is my first tuple. So here are my parentheses that define it. And I'm going to put 4 items in it. Let's say the first item is a cat. Second item is 1.2 as a string. The third item is 1.2 as a float. And then 0 and dog. That's more than 4? Yes, that is 5. So, okay, let's do 4 like this. So, here's my first tuple, and I had some print code in there to show what it is. And my first tuple has 4 things: a cat, 1.2 as a string, 1.2 as a float, and dog. So, I can also create an empty tuple. So, how do I do that? If I just open up the parentheses like this, and then I get an empty tuple. So, I've just assigned an empty tuple to this variable called empty tuple, and if we print that, we see that it's empty, right? Okay, so another way is to do a tuple with one element. That could be something that you want to do. So you might be thinking, oh, what if I do, I do something like this. 1 is lame as one element. Let's do 0.1. What if I do this, right? If I'm using the parentheses and do 0.1, I should have created a tuple. And let's print that. No, not really. It printed here, you see, without any parentheses. If I said here I wanted to see the type of one element tuple, it's actually a float. So it's not an actual tuple. So for me to create a tuple with one element, I have to put in a comma after the first element. And that way, you see when I print that, it comes out with parentheses around it, and that tells us that it's tuple. And if I look at the type, now Python is telling me, oh, this variable, one element tuple, is actually a tuple. Okay, so let's look at another way of initializing or instantiating a tuple, and that is without using the parentheses. So say I want to make a tuple 3, 54, and 1, right? If I just do that without the parentheses, the Python interpreter is smart enough to know that it is a tuple. And to prove it to you, let me show you the type of tuple, no parentheses, and that's a tuple, right? So that's another way to initialize a tuple. So let's take more of an engineering type example. One nice way of using tuples is to use them as vectors, but more specifically as basis vectors for a Cartesian coordinate. So we all know a Cartesian coordinate x, y, and z, and we all know that if you want to define any vector in those, we need the 3 basis vectors, I, j, and k. You might have seen them as I hat, j hat, and k hat in other engineering textbooks or lectures or whatever. But anyway, they're all the same. So I is the unit vector pointing in the x direction, j is the unit vector pointing in the y direction, and k is the unit vector pointing in the z direction. So I can define those as tuples. Oops, not 2. If it was 2, it would not be a unit vector anymore. So this is 0, 1, 0, and then 0, 0, 1. So if I print that, I can see, okay, the bases for the Cartesian coordinate system are 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1. So another way to look at a tuple is it doesn't have to contain the same kind of elements or any sort of primitive types like floats and strings that we've been using so far. It can actually contain more complicated things, like it can have a list. And I have a video on lists on YouTube. Make sure to check it out. It can also have a tuple. And it can have a boolean. It can have a tuple of a list inside of it. So this is a tuple with lists inside of it. right? So you can see I have a tuple here that has a list, that has a tuple, that has a boolean, and that has a tuple of lists inside of it. So you can see here how with only the concept of a tuple and a list, you can start creating very complicated data structures, and you can store a lot of different kinds of data in those objects. So the next thing I want to talk about is accessing items inside of a tuple. So we can access items inside of a tuple the same way as we can do with lists, which is by using indexing and by using slicing. Let's start out with indexing. So let's look at the tuple of objects that we just created earlier, and I want to see the first element inside that tuple. And remember, Python indexing starts from 0, so that would give us the first element. And so the first element here is 1, 2, 3, which is the same as we saw from the output here when we created the tuple. So now let's see if we want to see the last element of the tuple itself. So tuple of objects, and the last element, with index -1, similar as what we've introduced in the lists video. And we can see here the last element is the tuple of lists that we put in the tuple over there. So this is a tuple right here of lists, and we've created it here in this tuple, and you can see we've been able to retrieve it, right? Cool. So one other way to look at whatever's inside a tuple is by doing slicing. So say I have a tuple here that I want to slice. I want to see the first 3 elements inside that tuple that I want to slice. So let's copy that tuple here, and let's say if I want to do the first 3, I'm going to start from index 0, and I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3, right? So because 0, 1, and 2 are the first 3 elements, so that gives me the first 3 elements. If I want to look at the last 2 elements, I'll do -2 all the way to the end. And if I want to do elements 1, 2, 3, then I do 1 all the way to 4, right? So I'm printing those. So for the first one, we're saying the first 3 elements, which are apple, banana, and grape. That's correct. And then for the last 2 elements, I'm saying I want hello and Python, which is also correct. And also for the elements from 1 to 3, 0, 1, so that's 1, 2, and 3, right, up to hello. Remember, Python indexes from 0 and not from 1 like other languages. So let's move on to modifying a tuple. We can't actually modify a tuple because, as I defined earlier, if you remember, a tuple is an immutable Python object. And a immutable Python object means you cannot change the contents of that object after it's been created or instantiated. And if you want to learn about mutable objects, feel free to check out my video on lists, because lists are mutable objects. But I want to bring this up here because here's an immutable tuple, and these commands that I've commented out are actually not allowed. And I'm going to uncomment one right here, and I'll show you what happens if you actually do run that. It says, oh, this is not the reason. Okay, here we go. It says, okay, tuple object does not support item assignment. That's because the tuple has already been created, it's been put into memory, and we can't mess with it after that, right? So I'm just going to comment those out, and I'll leave those for you to play around with. You can get this code on GitHub, and you can see how an immutable object, after you create it, you can't really do anything with it. And finally, before I end, I want to talk about some useful operations for tuples. So let's make 2 tuples here. Any 2 tuples, really, it doesn't matter. And I want to show you that given 2 tuples, or more than 2, but just to show you some operations on them, if we use the plus operator, we can, they don't really add element by element. So this is kind of similar to lists. It will basically put both of them together and create a new tuple for you, which is the first and the second one. So you notice here the first one was 1, 2, and 4, and then the second one was 7, 8, 15, and 6. So it concatenates them together. And if you use the asterisk or the multiplication operator, it doesn't really multiply the elements inside the tuple. It actually duplicates the tuple the number of times that you multiply by. So we're duplicating tuple number 1, which is 1, 2, and 4, the way we've defined it up here. And it's being duplicated 3 times. And this is useful when you want to create a tuple that has, repeated values inside of it all at once. It's nice short syntax to do that. And the last thing is to check the in operation, or to check if something belongs inside or is available inside a tuple. And so what you do is you just say 7 in tuple, and it's basically asking, is the element of value 7 available inside this tuple? And for tuple number 2, that is true, 7 is here. And tuple number 1, that is not true, so it returns a false, because it's not in here. And with that, the Intro to Tuples video in the Python for Engineers series comes to an end. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, hit that thumbs up button and feel free to subscribe to the channel because we appreciate your support. Thank you for watching.